In part 4, we continue with a comparison between normativity and transnormativity, starting with sexuality norms. Sexuality norms have traditionally regulated the role of gender in sexual behavior. If the group's survival hinges on adding to its numbers, why not only sanction sexual activity between members who can produce valuable offspring? This customary practice of emphasizing reproduction does not go away easily, especially in those groups who still fear their survival, or at least the only way of life they have ever known, is repeatedly threatened. This intersection between sexuality and gender norms tends to assume a population of only two distinct genders, each ready in young adulthood to procreate with the other. Sexual orientation norms developed around this assumption that gender is a strict binary between two distinct types of people who can procreate. Fixed attention on survival tends to leave one inattentive to the actual diversity of gender and sexuality in nature. The prevalence of intersexuality and transgenderism suggests nature is not so narrowly geared toward reproduction. Think of gender as what is possible under the normative curve. Clustering around the center is the typical gendered person. Deviating from the central norm are those who fall outside of the gender normative bubble, who in some way are gender transnormative outliers. Perhaps it will help to look at this as two normative curves mirroring each other, with the top representing femininity and the inverted curve below representing masculinity. The yin-yang symbol helps to illustrate this dynamic as well, as two complementary energies flowing together. Therefore, the outliers of each normative curve actually bleed into the other normative curve. These represent the NEN of gender, the full range of gendered possibilities. Within this, we find humanly constructed gender norms. Femininity is generally allows more variation in expression than masculinity, so illustrated here as a relatively wider curve. Overlaying these are the culturally defined categories of gender, the conventionality of femininity above and the conventionality of masculinity below. However, since the 1960s, these conventions have expanded to include much of the variation commonly encountered. Instead of a circle, it may help to illustrate gender as two dominant modalities along a continuum of gendered possibilities. The culturally defined gender categories also overlay the natural midpoints. The only thing dividing what is considered feminine and what is considered masculine is an arbitrary line that signifies when there is more of one kind of trait than the other. Gender transnormativity pulls the feminine person to encounter a more masculine defined potential, while the masculine person is pulled to encounter more feminine defined potential. He finds himself compelled to cry more often, and to be more nurturing to his young. She finds herself compelled to be more assertive in public and independently decisive. They push the envelope without actually transgressing gender norm boundaries. For many, this is as far as they will ever be pulled toward integrating both gendered sides. But there are those who will be compelled to encounter and integrate more of these gendered possibilities, even at the risk of being vilified. He will enjoy ballet, fearlessly dancing in public while in tights. She will confidently operate heavy construction equipment. Then there are those who boldly explore gender where few have gone before. In fact, this is merely nature's pull to embrace all that is naturally possible within the natural gender norm. Yes, this is getting beyond mere gender transnormativity and stretching toward gender transconventionality, toward the transgender experience. For some, this means being born in the wrong body. Transitioning then brings them in line with the gender they internally know themselves to be. They return to a familiar, socially recognized gender modality. Besides gender and sexuality norms, there are other norms affecting our need for balance. There are norms for ethnic identity, for religious affiliation, and for political orientation. Each includes natural modalities that serve as a foundation for culturally determined norms. Ethnic identity provides a set of norms for gaining access to social supports. Those of the same ethnicity readily understand one another, in contrast to those of a different ethnicity. They share a common language, a common heritage, a common culture, and a common worldview. This identity is itself a norm. There is a natural emergent basis for organizing our world into insiders who can be trusted for needed social supports and outsiders who could present a threat to survival. Such in-group identification is a modality opposite of out-group identification, of those we recognize as not a member of our group. Ethnicity as a norm, as a way of guiding human behavior, tends to converge into a divisive in-group out-group binary. This can turn hostile between the privileged and less privileged ethnicities. What began as a unifying force can then get in the way of reaching full potential in modern society. Ethnic transnormativity is the natural phenomenon of counteracting such limits to growth. Transgressing the rigid cultural barrier between in-group and out-group identification expresses transnormativity. Instead of viewing other ethnicities as potential foes, there is a transcendence of ethnic differences, of cross-cultural identification, and a movement toward connecting with all as an expression of self-actualization. Religious affiliation is similar to ethnicity in providing a set of norms for accessing social supports, but also for finding some meaningful connection greater than oneself, and much more. Like ethnicity, this itself is a norm. There is a natural emergent basis for seeking a meaningful existence beyond the confines of the self. This could be called spirituality, but frequently takes expression in a religious form already established by others. Religious affiliation and expressions as a norm, as a way of guiding human behavior, tends also to converge into a divisive in-group out-group binary. Instead of inspiring universal love, it may result in highly unbridgeable differences. This inflexibility can also interfere with reaching one's full spiritual potential. Religious transnormativity is now common. Cultural barriers between different faith groups are increasingly more flexible. Perhaps the last binary in religion is between belief in a religion and being completely irreligious, with much variation in between. Political orientation, where one falls along the political spectrum, tends to be another in-group out-group binary. Political values expressed by this orientation are also norms for accessing social supports, primarily about prioritizing publicly available resources. There is a natural, emergent basis for prioritizing our resources. Should more of our resources be pooled for the broader good, or should they be used as each sees fit? Political values as a norm, as a way of influencing human behavior, tend to converge into another divisive in-group out-group binary. The more energies invested into the conflict, the less energies available to develop full potential. Political transnormativity transgresses political barriers as nature compels one to counteract the more constricting limits of political conflict. Political silos are breached in the interest to better empathize with the people behind the political contentions. Humanly constructed norms are thrust aside to allow nature to restore much needed balance below the parochial concerns of the defenders of these norms. Almost everyone in modern society is transnormative in some way. It is practically impossible to not depart by some degree from outmoded cultural norms, but not all are transconventional. This discussion will conclude in part 5.